Hello, young scholars, and here we are for yet another podcast on various topics in AP World and European history. Today, as you see, we will be discussing the gunpowder empires in West and South Asia. We're looking mostly at the early modern period. We're talking 14, 15, 16, and to a lesser degree, sort of 17, 1800s. And we are looking in West and South Asia, so we're talking Middle East, we're talking modern-day Iran, we're talking India. So before we get started, let's make note of the fact that when we are talking about these sort of early modern absolute states in general, and this is certainly going to include all of our absolutist states in Europe, our Habsburgs, Prussia under the Hohenzollerns, Romanov Russia, Bourbon France, and so forth and so on. A couple of key distinguishing features that we're generally going to be looking for. First of all, centralized government. Things like expanded bureaucracy, usually dependent on a middle class that is loyal to the king rather than to the church or other authorities, which often means reducing the power of the nobility. The construction of palaces and sometimes other edifices in order to display power. The gaining of territory and power becoming more important than religious matters, which obviously this is a notion that we would connect with Machiavellianism. Also, expansionist policies, frequently to sort of gain new territory, particularly to gain colonies as well. And then this notion that the king or queen is the king or queen because of divine right, that they have been selected by God, that they have this connection to the religious authority. Frequently, they are also patrons of the arts. They're going to have large standing armies, which is obviously necessary to implement some of this territory gaining and colony establishing, and all that's going to be paid for with relatively high taxes. Now, again, most of these trends we will see in these gunpowder empires as well, but not necessarily all of them. And so what I've done is I've conducted a slightly different list that I think is going to apply. Obviously, we still have the centralized government, although this business about the middle class is going to be less true here. In these gunpowder states, we're not going to kind of see the sort of vibrant new middle class that we are seeing develop in Europe, in part because they're not going to be as closely connected to this sort of new trade that is growing up, this new maritime trade, which obviously is so crucial to the development of the middle class in, say, the Netherlands, in Britain, and so on. However, they are going to have taxes. We are going to see the standing armies. We are going to see the expansionist policies, although this notion of mercantilism is going to be more restricted to Europe, and we're not as interested in colony building as well because, again, we're not working as much overseas. We are also patrons of the arts. We are certainly going to maintain that connection to religious authority, even though it may not exactly be the sort of divine right that we see in Europe. And we're going to have to reduce the power of the traditional nobility, and we're going to build both palaces and mosques to display our authority, to display our greatness. So let's do a quick overview of all of these states. Okay, this is the region that we're going to be looking at here. Okay, a couple of things to keep in mind when all of these empires come into existence in the 13, 14, 1500s, depending on exactly where you are and who's expanding where and so forth and so on. We are really going to be looking at the sort of aftermath of the Mongol conquests. You remember the Mongol kingdoms, or khanates, I should say, begin to collapse in the late 13th and then into the 14th century, and there is certainly a power vacuum left. There's a lot of territory that used to be sort of unified under a central political unit that no longer is. And so there's room there for somebody to come in and take that place. And of course, during this period, there's still a lot of very, very, very valuable commerce going on in here. Obviously, India is still very closely connected to both the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean trade. And then these areas in Anatolia, in Persia, still very closely connected to the Silk Road as well, and then also in some cases the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and all that sort of thing. And so where there is no centralized rule and a lot of money, that's going to be an area that is ripe for conquest, particularly given the fact that a lot of these regions are relatively agriculturally prosperous. I mean, obviously in some of these places it's rather dry. We're certainly not growing a lot of stuff around, Medina, for example, but some of these regions like Anatolia, like parts of Iran, like parts of India, very agriculturally productive and can support large populations. So let's start with our Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans are a dynasty of Turks. They are started by a gentleman named Osman, and hence the name. And you're going to see, if we look at our light pink here, they're going to start out in sort of western Anatolia, right? This region around the city of Bursa, that sort of thing. And then slowly over the course of the 14th century, they're going to expand outward from there. They're going to conquer the rest of Anatolia. They're going to start advancing into the Balkans with their boundary initially being sort of the Danube River here. So they're going to conquer Greece. They're going to conquer much of what is today Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, that kind of thing. They are taking advantage of a weakened Byzantine state. You will recall that the Byzantines have not only been dealing with fighting against various Islamic states and other Turkic peoples, the Seljuks in particular, for the last several hundred years, but they've also in some cases have had to fight Western Crusaders as well. You hopefully remember that during the Fourth Crusade in 1204, the city of Constantinople was actually sacked by European Crusaders, and so Constantinople has been sort of clinging to life ever since, and it's not until 1453 that the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, with a large army, a large fleet, and now these sort of big new things called cannons, manages to conquer the city, establish it as his new capital, and then begin sort of revitalizing it. As you can see, based on our orange territory here, the Ottomans are really going to hit their stride in sort of the 16th and early 17th centuries. They're going to advance north of the Danube into sort of Eastern Europe. They're going to start taking control of territory in what will eventually become southern Russia. They're going to be brought into conflict with the Habsburgs of the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, they're going to lay siege to the Habsburg capital of Vienna several times over the course of the 16th, 17th century. They will conquer North Africa. They will also conquer parts of Saudi Arabia, to include Mecca and Medina, are two sort of holiest cities in Islam. And they will also be fighting against the Safavid state over here, taking control of Baghdad in 1534, and so forth and so on. And they're going to sort of reach their peak under a series of sultans in this period, particularly Suleiman the Magnificent, also known as Suleiman the Lawgiver, who is not only going to be sort of expanding the empire on land, but also trying to build a navy to take control of large sections of the Mediterranean. You can see as well that there is a very brief attempt to sort of advance into Italy. They captured the port of Otranto for a relatively brief period in the 1400s. However, really after, say, about 1680 or 1700, the Ottoman state, even though it's going to survive, is going to enter into a period of decline. And these are all things that we'll investigate later in the course. They're going to lose control of Egypt. They're going to fall behind technologically. But they will limp along and survive. And the Ottoman Empire will actually fight in World War I on the side of Austria and Germany. And of course, after the war, well, actually before the war, the last Ottoman Sultan will be taken out of power, and then after the war, the Ottoman state will be sort of divided up amongst the victorious allies. It will be taken control of by Britain and France and so forth and so on. So that's what's eventually going to become our Ottoman Empire, but we'll get there. Meanwhile, to the east, we have this Safavid Persian state. It is established right around the year 1500, starting with a ruler called Ismail I, who is going to build an empire based on theocratic Shiism. You recall Shiism, our sort of second sect in Islam in terms of percentage of the population. It's certainly less popular by straight numbers than Shiism, but it is going to be relatively popular in Iran, and this is in many ways the legacy of the Safavid state. Specifically, The Safavids pursue a form of Shiism called Twelver Shiism, in which they believe that there are sort of, after the Prophet, there are these 12 infallible imams, and Ismail actually sort of claims to be this missing 12th imam at one point. Relatively quickly, they're going to expand and take control using these Turkish military soldiers that they have who are loyal to Ismail as the 12th imam. But eventually, they're going to sort of run out of gas when they move into Mesopotamia and they run into the Ottoman Empire. They are going to fight a battle in 1514 at a place called Calderon, and they are going to be defeated by the Ottomans, in part because at this point the Ottomans have adopted cannons and other gunpowder weapons the Safavids had not. So the Safavids actually lose control of some of this territory in here. They later have to fight to take it back, and really after that they're going to be more concerned about maintaining their state and kind of holding on until they finally sort of break apart in the 1730s. And then finally, over here to the east, we have our Mughal state. Mughal state is going to start with a gentleman named Babur, who is a descendant of Tamerlane and Genghis Khan. And so, really, this is really pretty scary because now we're talking Mongols with cannons. He manages to carve out a little state for himself up here in what is today Afghanistan, Pakistan. And then his heirs are going to continue sort of pushing south into the lower parts of India. They will also survive into the 17 and 1800s when essentially they will be conquered by Europeans, the French, the British, so forth and so on, and ultimately, India will become sort of one of the centerpieces of the British Empire, the so-called jewel in the crown. Now, when we look at all of these gunpowder states, we can really talk about them having a lot of things in common. And given the significance of the notion of comparing and contrasting in AP World History, I want to really sort of focus on these various commonalities. So, what do these states have in common? Well, first of all, they're all involved in overseas trade, or should I say long-distance trade. Many of these major cities, like Istanbul, Cairo, Isfahan, Delhi, obviously Istanbul, the former Constantinople here, Cairo, Isfahan, capital of the Safavid state over here, and then Delhi and some of the others. These are important international trade hubs. These are the places where all the roads are running in. These are places that in many ways can be accessed by sea, particularly Constantinople, Cairo, along important waterborne trade routes. Certainly a lot of the cities in southern India as well, as we saw with the post-classical kingdom of Chola. And so we definitely want to be aware of the fact that these guys are continuing to engage in long-distance trade. In fact, the nickname of the city of Isfahan was half the world. There was this view that, first of all, at least for the Safavids, it was an incredibly important city, but also that it was an important city to the world in the sense that there's a lot of trade going through, a lot of different types of people could be found there sort of selling their goods and that sort of thing, and that it represented a relatively cosmopolitan society, right? And certainly the same could be said of a lot of these major trade cities. I mean, if you were in Istanbul in 1500, you would have found Turks, Greeks, Afghans, Russians, Italians, all kinds of different people who are coming together for the purposes of commerce. And so obviously, if we can have commerce, we can regulate it, we can tax it, and that is certainly an important part of the sort of economic base of these states. Second thing they have in common, gunpowder and conquest. These are all actually images of Ottoman weapons from the period that we're talking about, 15, 16, 1700s. And obviously, these states are dependent on gunpowder for their conquest. You wouldn't be much of an empire if you didn't take over any territory, right? So we mentioned the fact that the Ottomans in particular are going to take control of vast swaths of territory in both Southwest Asia and in Eastern Europe, again, causing a lot of trouble for the Habsburgs, laying siege to the city of Vienna several times And early on, at least, they are definitely going toe-to-toe with these Europeans in terms of the available military technology. The Safavids we mentioned after Calderon in 1514 are going to, where they did not use gunpowder weapons because they saw them as unmanly. They're going to say, yeah, we got to hop on that gunpowder train, get some of that going. So they also start trading with Europeans to get their hands on these gunpowder weapons, and that's going to allow them to continue to sort of compete with the Ottomans for control of some of these territories that you see here in this sort of checkered area, right? This territory where the two empires butt up against each other, where the border may shift back and forth, depending on who won battles in which year and all that kind of thing. And then certainly the Mughals as well. Remember, there's a legacy of gunpowder use dating back into the Mongol period, where the Mongols had begun adapting it from the Chinese. So, other similarities we want to look at: bureaucracy and administrators. Okay, as we have seen sort of ad nauseum by this point in the course, you really can't run an empire as a monarch. You've got to have somebody to help you. You've got to have somebody who is going to be in all the places that you can't be in to make sure that things come out the way that you want. So in the Mughal state in India, we're going to have these gentlemen who are called zamindars. Okay, zamindars. The zamindars are going to be initially responsible for collecting taxes. So they are a new elite that is being established by the Mughal state. They're being pulled up from the ranks of the army. They're being pulled up from the lower nobility. And over time, they are going to establish themselves almost as little sort of mini kings of their own sort of mini states. They will, in fact, begin to call themselves rajas, which is this word that we see in Sanskrit for king, for monarch, and obviously connected through Indo-European roots to the word royal in the Western world. Now, these zamindars are able to do this, are able to take control of this territory, primarily because they are given a particular region that they're supposed to look after, and they continue to look over that region as long as they hold their post. They're able to sort of develop a local power base in that way. Our Safavids, meanwhile, are relying on a lot of those same old Persian administrative techniques that we see going all the way back to people like Darius in the Achaemenid period. Not necessarily identical, but a lot of the same ideas. We're going to have sort of regional governors where you may have spies going and checking up on people. We're going to depend on these old road systems and to send messages and so forth and so on. The Ottomans, meanwhile, are doing a couple of sort of new things. So first of all, the Ottomans, not unlike many of our Chinese dynasties, are making use of eunuchs. These are men who have been castrated in order to prevent them from having any offspring, and thereby theoretically giving them less reason to have sort of a private, personal agenda against the monarch. These eunuchs, in some cases, well, they start out as sort of harem guards to sort of protect the sultan's concubines and that sort of thing. Obviously, there are reasons why you would want a eunuch to hold that particular post, but subsequently they're also going to become viziers, that is to say advisors, government officials. They're going to start participating in the running of the government, and in some cases, some of them are going to become extremely, extremely powerful. There's also another system that we develop for providing ourselves with these viziers, these advisors that you see pictured here, and that is something called the Devshirme. This is a really, really important notion. Those of you who are in my class, we're going to talk about this. It's going to seem to keep coming up over and over and over again when we talk about the Ottomans. Because the Ottomans were taking over these older Byzantine territories, they found themselves, as Muslim leaders, suddenly ruling over large territories that had Christian populations. And so you find yourself going, okay, how are we going to control these Christian populations? How are we going to involve them in the state, and so forth and so on? And some aspects of this policy we're going to look at later. But what they do with the devshirme is they go to these various Christian villages and they say, hey, you guys owe us a handful of boys. Boys from your town. In exchange for that, by the way, we're going to give you a certain amount of local autonomy and religious freedom and all that sort of thing. We are going to take your boys. We are going to take them back to a school where they will be converted to Islam and they will be educated and they will be trained. And then eventually they will either become warriors who will form the core of the Ottoman army and they will be called janissaries, or they will become administrators. They will become, viziers and that sort of thing. So the Ottomans basically find that this is a way for them to get the raw bodies that they need to fill out both the army and the sort of administrative bureaucratic core. It's also a way to guarantee the loyalty of these local Christian populations because they're offering them sort of autonomy and freedoms in exchange for giving their boys, but then they're also saying like, hey, the guys who are running this empire are your kids. But it's also the boys, they're able to generate relatively extraordinary loyalty in them because they're separating them from their families, from their old belief structures and all that sort of thing. So it's a relatively clever system. All right, moving on. Other similarities: power through architecture. This is going to be a big one. We'll start with the Ottomans. So when the Ottomans come into sort of the Byzantine state, particularly when they conquer these major cities like Constantinople and Thessalonica and so forth and so on, they are going to find a pretty significant architectural legacy already left to them. Certainly, my students will recall the construction of buildings like Hagia Sophia in the reign of Justinian. And one thing that we need to keep in mind about all three of these groups, right? All three of these gunpowder empires that we're looking at, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, have nomadic or semi-nomadic origins. They come from these Mongol Turkic peoples who are kind of hanging out in Central Asia. And if you're a nomadic people, you obviously don't have a lot of experience building these sort of permanent, large, megalithic type structures that are going to sort of guarantee the displays of your power and authority. And so what we're going to see with all of these groups is that they are going to lean on the architectural traditions of the people that they conquer. Certainly, if we look at these two mosques here, the Blue Mosque and the Suleimani Mosque, which were built within about 50 years or so of each other, the late 16th, early 17th century in Istanbul and Constantinople. You should, if you're looking carefully, notice a lot of legacies of those Byzantine architectural styles. In fact, these don't necessarily look that dissimilar from Hagia Sophia, right? We've got the big domes, we've got the sort of smaller semi-domes to help hold up the bigger domes, and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, we have added these minarets because we have this call to prayer that is to be issued across the city. And you see some of the same architectural designs here. This is Topkapi Palace, which was the palace of the Ottoman sultans in Constantinople during much of this period. Now, obviously, it's not identical. You can see they've started to sort of adapt the shape of the domes and do some different things with them. They've started employing some pointed archways that weren't common to Byzantine and Romanesque architectural work. But certainly we can see a little bit of a legacy there, right? This, by the way, is the inside of the Suleimani Mosque. Again, we should be seeing a lot of those trends, those Byzantine architectural trends. We've got the pendentives. We actually, if we look at these banded archways, maybe this reminds us of some of that older Cordoban architecture, which isn't necessarily something the Ottomans would have directly encountered, but is certainly something that is that they're familiar with. So again, major architectural legacy here coming from the sort of the conquered peoples. And I would argue we're going to see some of the same things with the Safavids. This is the Royal Mosque in Isfahan. Again, we see the use of domes. We have this very Persian architectural style, right, which incorporates some sort of older, Achaemenid designs, and some of this sort of vegetal stuff that we saw in some of the Parthian societies. We have these sort of onion domes that have been working their way from sort of the Turkic and the rest of the Dar al-Islam into Persia. So certainly a legacy there. This, by the way, is the inside of that mosque. One of the things that I see a lot in Persian architecture that strikes me as being very unique to the, well, maybe not sort of unique, but very typical of Persian architecture is this extreme level of decoration. I mean, obviously you can see every square inch here has been decorated either with paint or with tile. Certainly also if you look around the band here, one thing that should tip you off to what part of the world you're in is that you're seeing this writing in Arabic and so forth and so on. Okay. And then Mughal architecture, obviously the most famous piece would be the Taj Mahal, which was built as a mausoleum by one of the Mughal emperors, Shah Jahan, to his dead wife. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that he had actually planned a second mausoleum for himself that was going to be done all in black marble that would sort of mirror this one. And then this is one of the Mughal capitals at a place called Fatehpur Sikri. This was built as sort of a retreat for the ruler, a place for him to sort of get away from it all. And obviously, the architectural style here, much more Eastern than anything that we've really looked at up to this point in the Islamic world. So certainly there's some Indian, and I would argue even some Chinese legacies that maybe we're looking at here. To me, at least, and I'm certainly no architectural historian, so maybe I'm completely off base, but some of these roofing designs here have an almost sort of pagoda-like quality to them. And certainly the notion of sort of this pillar construction is not something that we really see much in the Islamic world, these sort of open buildings with pillars and all that kind of thing. So our next similarity that we want to look at beyond sort of this powerful architecture that is built to show off our authority and in some cases our connection to the religious, because obviously we saw a lot of mosques here, but also has this sort of architectural legacy from the conquered peoples. Next similarity we want to look at is connection to these religious authorities. So once again, mosque construction. Right, very, very popular way for rulers to show their support, and this is something that we've seen in a number of other societies. Right, I mean, remember if we look at an earlier time period in India, and we have Ashoka's adoption of Buddhism. He starts building stupas. If we were to look at medieval Europe, certainly we have a lot of the great cathedrals that are being sponsored by monarchs and other local rulers as a way to demonstrate their piety. So this is nothing new per se. We also have a lot of claims that are made to religious authority. Our Ottoman Sultan is going to style himself as the new Caliph. He's going to say, the Abbasids have been wiped out, and particularly after the Ottomans conquer much of the Dar al-Islam, they're going to say it is clear that we have established ourselves as the new sort of leaders of the Islamic world. We are the protectors of the city of Mecca. And so therefore we have this claim to religious authority. They are also going to consider themselves closely connected to the Ghazi. The Ghazi are these Islamic sort of holy warriors. And so many times the Ottomans will classify these wars that they're fighting against the Safavids or against the Austrian Habsburgs or other, the Venetians, the Genoans, other, European peoples. They're going to classify those wars as jihads in the name of Sunni Islam. Meanwhile, in the Safavid state, as I mentioned earlier, we developed something of a theocracy that's based on this notion of Twelver Shi'ism, in which the Shah, which is their term for the ruler, the king, the Shah of the Safavid state is not only seen as a political figure, but he's also very closely connected to the 12 Imams and to Ali and so forth and so on. And with a lot of these guys, we will also see they're going to have a lot of Sufis hanging out at their courts, right? I mean, who do you want around if you're trying to establish the connection between your religious faith and your political leadership? Well, you're going to want to have these sort of religious missionaries and scholars around, in part because a lot of these guys are also some of the better educated individuals in these gunpowder states. And then finally, finally, if we look at the Mughal state, we have a couple of things going on. The Mughal state, obviously, population dominated by Hinduism during this period. There is an Islamic minority, and obviously they are going to be more loyal to the ruling class because obviously the Mughal emperors are going to be Muslim. However, we will also see that the Mughal ruler Akbar will attempt to create this sort of new faith that he calls the divine faith, which is a syncretic faith that attempts to combine aspects of Hinduism and Islam under this notion of loyalty to the emperor. He will also be very supportive of the development of Sikhism, which is another faith that sort of combines elements of Islamic and Hindu tradition. And some of our later Mughal emperors, particularly Aurangzeb, will just straight up be very, very supportive of Islam, right? So that connection to Islam is going to be very, very important for a lot of these rulers. Next thing we want to look at, treatment of minorities and outsiders. This is something that a lot of these states have some things in common, but maybe some things not so in common. So first of all of these states, on some level, are going to have to be tolerant of either Muslims of different sects or people of different religious faiths. I talked about the fact that this notion of demi-status and the payment of the jizya, which remember is that tax that was paid by Jews and Christians to the Muslim authorities, right? This is still in place throughout much of the Islamic world, okay? And we are going to see elements of that in pretty much all three of these states. The Ottomans, of course, are going to establish these special communities called the millet, or the millet, from which they're going to draw those boys from the Devshirme, and they're going to go to these Christian communities, and basically, instead of just giving demi-status to individual persons, they're going to say, we're going to give this special status to this whole community. So if you provide boys for the Devshirme, if you go along with the program and pay your taxes, then we will give you a great deal of local autonomy, and we'll just kind of let you guys do their thing. And that is why, even today, if you look around in parts of the world that used to be part of the Ottoman Empire, whether it's in Armenia or southeastern Europe or even Egypt, we still have these small but relatively significant Christian minorities. Also, the Ottomans are certainly not so into their religion that it will cause them to ignore a good deal. So the Ottomans at various times will have pretty positive relationships with Venice. You remember Venice, our Italian sort of city-state and a major sort of trade player, in some ways an imperial power during this period unto themselves, since they have these little trade posts and forts sort of scattered throughout the Mediterranean that they use to sort of ply their trade. And obviously they set up a trade deal with the Ottomans that they will kind of be the middlemen between the Ottomans and the rest of Europe, right? So even though they are not co-religionists, even though they fight sometimes, relatively positive relationship there. And then of course we have this notion of the Devshirme, where we're granting these privileges to these millet communities in exchange for them providing boys whom we're then going to convert to Islam and turn them into janissaries and viziers. In the Safavid state, we are remarkably intolerant of other Muslims. In fact, starting with Ismail, the Safavids are going to force Sunni Muslims to convert to Shiism. However, like our Ottomans, the Safavids are not so dedicated to their faith that they'll ignore a good deal, and so Shah Abbas, who is one of our greatest shahs in the Safavid state, actually argues at one point. He says, "I prefer the dust off of Christian boots to the most glorified Ottoman. And he actually was willing to let Christian missionaries come in and establish small monasteries and embassies in exchange for them sort of coming in and trading. We want to trade with these Europeans, even if sometimes, particularly the Portuguese, their sort of imperial ambitions, the trade routes they want to control, the cities they want to take control of, even if that's sometimes going to cause us to disagree and come into conflict, we still want to have trade contact there. Okay. The Mughals, obviously, large Hindu minority, and I apologize very much for all my capitalization errors here. I had to make this on the quick, so bear with me. A lot of our members of this sort of Hindu, well, power, in terms of power, they're a minority, but in terms of population, they're actually a majority. They have to be treated relatively well. So our Mughals, first of all, give lots of low-level government posts to our Hindus, even though, obviously, our Muslims who are more closely associated with the Mughal state are holding all of our high-level positions. They also got rid of the jizya tax. Now, remember, of course, traditionally speaking, Hindus would not have been covered under dhimmi status. According to sort of older forms of Islam, say if we were to look back at, the Pact of Umar, if we were to look at the initial expansion of the Islamic State under, say, the Umayyads, they would have seen Hindus as not being people of the book. They would never have afforded them jizya status. But the Mughals are having to sort of recognize reality here. There are too many Hindus for us to sort of treat them as really low-level, second or third-class citizens. It's not going to work. So they get rid of the jizya tax. They don't ask Hindus to pay it. They incorporate some of them into the government and so on. They also encourage syncretism. We talked about that divine faith of Akbar. We talked about the growth of Sikhism and so forth. This is all going to change, actually, in the 1700s, though. Aurangzeb, who is one of our Mughal emperors, 1700s, he is going to have a lot of very conservative Muslim clerics at his court, and they are going to encourage him to, you need to be growing Islam. You need to not allow these non-Muslims to have so much play. So he actually brings back the jizya tax. He starts building a lot of mosques and starts encouraging more conversion. This is actually going to kind of get him into some trouble. It's going to sort of antagonize the Hindu population. It's going to cause some issues. Like I said, we will see some intolerance. Obviously, in the Ottoman Devshirme, these boys are going to be forced to convert to Islam. And we also talked about the Safavids forcing people to convert from Sunni to Shia Islam, which I suppose might be somewhat easier for people to tolerate maybe than a shift from, say, Christianity to Islam, depending on one's views. Obviously, there were a lot of Muslims that viewed these Twelver Shiites as being, or Twelver Shiites, I should say, as being highly heretical. And then, even though I've mentioned this, let's talk about it again. How did these people treat Europeans? Well, certainly they liked a lot of their technology. All of these states are importing European guns at one point or another, because by the time we're getting into the 1700s, the Europeans are producing the best firearms in the world. No questions asked. However, they don't really like a lot of other European ideas. Remember, if we're talking 15, 16, 1700s, this is the time period of the European Renaissance. This is the time of the Enlightenment. This is the time when Europeans are beginning to sort of reject their more sort of religious ideologies in exchange for a worldview that is more based on scientific discovery and individual liberty and all that sort of thing. And by and large, these gunpowder states were not willing to accept that, either because it was a danger to Islam culturally, or because it was a danger to the state politically. So they were willing to buy their guns. They were certainly willing to trade with them. But kind of like we saw with some of our East Asian societies, like the Ming and Qing dynasties in China and the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan, they want to try and shield their population from these outside influences, from the dilution of their culture. We'll talk about that more in a second. So, Reasons for the decline of these various gunpowder states. Again, I mentioned at the outset that the Safavids are actually going to collapse in the 18th century. They will sort of fall apart under pressure from some Uzbek and Afghani states that are starting to rise up. The Mughals will collapse in the 17 and 1800s, in part due to local problems and in part because of the influx of the European empires, particularly the British. And then the Ottomans will manage to sort of limp along for some time until the early part of the 20th century, when they will be destroyed as well. So why did this happen? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, trade is an issue. We talked about the fact that a lot of these societies are trading internationally, but throughout this entire period, they are losing what we can call market share. They're losing how much of the market they can control to Europe. And that is largely because during this period, we are starting to see the golden age of this European shipping. In the 1500s, our Europeans are exploring, they're developing colonies, they're discovering sources of silver that are going to allow them to trade directly with China for the first time. They're taking control of all these trade ports. They're learning how to navigate these new ships over much longer distances. And so, kind of like we saw in the post-classical era, this trade over land and this trade that runs through these Ottoman states and Safavids and Mughals as well is just going to become less and less important to the global economy, which means the value of their goods is going to drop. They won't be able to charge as much in tax and all that sort of thing. Also, even though we will see the introduction of a lot of these new crops into the gunpowder states from the Americas, the introduction of corn and tobacco and so forth and so on, even though we have the introduction of a lot of these new crops, we're not going to see anywhere near as drastic population growth as we're going to get in East Asia and in Europe. For a couple of reasons, largely because they're just not going to adopt those crops on the same level that we're going to see in East Asia and Europe. In some cases, their agricultural systems aren't as set up for that sort of thing. I mean, how are you going to grow potatoes in Baghdad? I mean, it's just too hot. And then also the sort of local agricultural systems that were already in place, they felt like we're sort of already getting the job done. Why change? But when your population doesn't experience those periods of rapid growth, you're not necessarily creating the same demand for new goods. You may not be producing as much, and so over long periods of time, you're going to watch your ability to sort of function on the international trade market kind of drop off. Second, costly wars. Now remember, the cost of conquest during this period is growing. When you have a standing army, that army has to be paid and fed all the time. And because of the profusion of gunpowder weapons and the growth of a lot of these imperial states, just like we are seeing in Europe around the same time, fueling an army is getting much more expensive. Gunpowder ain't cheap. And casting cannons and having smiths make guns and building these big ships, it's not cheap. And so particularly for the Ottomans, who are essentially going to be fighting on two fronts. In the West, the Mediterranean, and in the Balkans, they will be fighting against the Habsburgs, and then in the East, they'll be fighting against the Safavids. The cost of these wars is going to sort of break the bank, so to speak. Particularly when you consider the fact we've already discussed their revenue was dropping off. And we're going to see the same thing with the Mughals and the Safavids as well. The Safavids are fighting the Ottomans. They're also having to fight these other sort of Afghan, Uzbek, Turkic peoples sort of to their northeast. The Mughals are having to attempt to deal from time to time with the growth of these rebellions by Hindu nationalists and that kind of thing. So just the cost of fighting these wars is going to make it very difficult for these states to continue to function the way that they want to. Further, we have what's called cultural conservatism. I talked about the fact that increasingly, as we get into the 16 and 1700s, conservative imams, conservative Islamic scholars in these three societies are going to be saying, listen, We need to have a return to a truer form of Islam. We have allowed ourselves to become distracted and diluted by the influence of all these foreign peoples, in some cases ones that we have conquered, and in some cases ones that we're trading with. Wahhabism, which is still very popular in Saudi Arabia, and is tied in some cases to the development of the theology of various fundamentalist Islamic groups such as Al Qaeda and ISIS, is developing in Saudi Arabia during this period, right, during the 1700s. And so as these conservative Muslim scholars start sort of yelling louder and louder and louder and louder, they're going to be heeded much more by these rulers in these gunpowder states. So, for example, a lot of this European technology that is allowing the Europeans to really get ahead commercially and sort of socially, they're going to reject. We will not see the printing press introduced to the Ottoman state, for example, until the 1700s. The Ottomans are trying very hard to keep it out. Even my students who read History of the World in 6 classes will probably also remember, I hope, that in some of these Islamic states they're doing things like outlawing the drinking of coffee and tobacco because it's seen as leading to this this licentious behavior and all that kind of stuff. Meanwhile, of course, in Europe, because they are opening themselves up much more to these new technological developments and these sort of new ideas about politics and all that sort of stuff, the pace of change in Europe is accelerating. And even though the gunpowder states are buying, new weapons and new technologies from the Europeans, they just can't keep up. And of course, as the sort of form of Islam that's being encouraged by the state becomes more and more conservative and more fundamentalist, a lot of our religious and ethnic minorities are going to become more and more dissatisfied. We talked about the fact that Aurangzeb in the Mughal Empire in the 1700s reintroduces the jizya tax. And so we're going to have a lot of little sort of Hindu rebellions going on. We will have a rebellion of the Greeks against the Ottoman state in the 1800s, and so forth and so on. You can sort of see where this is going to go, right? So this initial dynamism that in many cases is being driven by the absorption of ideas from outsiders and from conquered peoples, the stuff that these gunpowder states are taking from architecturally from conquered peoples, the new technologies they're getting from Europe, their willingness to trade with outsiders. The more and more that is sort of challenged by these imams, the more trouble that they're going to get themselves into, and eventually they're essentially just going to get overrun by Europeans. I'm going to go ahead and stop there. So thank you for bearing with me, and I'll see you next time.